of the keys to understanding the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24 is to realize that Jesus was just having a conversation with his disciples. And he wasn't just spewing out a chronological timeline of the end time events or the end time signs, but he was just having a conversation. And in verses 1 through 6, he is explaining the destruction of the temple. Now, of the disciples that we know for sure were present, which is Peter, James, John, and Andrew, we know that John was the only one that saw the actual destruction of the temple in his lifetime. Now, the other disciples would have for sure experienced the false Christ and the wars and rumors of wars that went on around the Roman Empire during the time of the Roman-Jewish wars and the events that led up to the destruction of the temple. But John would be the only one in that small group that would have personally eyewitnessed the destruction of the temple and the total end of Jerusalem and the nation state of Israel. And so that's kind of interesting to think about. Well, then Jesus answers the second part question of the disciples in verses 7 and 8. And he gives them basically some general signs of the second coming and the end of the age. And then he goes even farther, rather than just leaving it really vague like that. He then goes on in verses 9 through 14, and we talked about this in the last video, that he begins to talk specifically about some prophecies and some things that were going to happen with the disciple in their lifetime, as far as them spreading the gospel and this gospel going out to the whole world, something that Jesus prophesied would happen right up to the very end. And we saw how that will even be taking place during the tribulation period. But the gospel will be going out to the entire world right up to the end. And then will be his second coming. Then he will put his foot on the Mount of Olives and set up his millennial kingdom in Jerusalem. And the restoration of Jerusalem after being trodden under by the Gentiles since 70 AD and before, will come to an end at his second coming and putting his foot on the Mount of Olives. And so he tells the disciples that this is the beginning of their ministry to spread the gospel to the entire world. And that continues to us as disciples today as part of what we should be doing, why we're waiting for that great and awesome day of the Lord, or more precisely, days of the Lord to come. But now we see he transitions again. He talks about the destruction of the temple, the general signs of the second coming and the end of the age, the specific prophecy and events in the disciples' lives themselves as he shares that intimate conversation with them. And now he gives them even more information of the future. And he says, look out when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. So he switches another period, and he switches here again, and he says, now I'm going to talk about the tribulation. And so basically verses 15 through 26 in Matthew 24, he is specifically talking about the tribulation period, that 7-year period of time that's in the future. We know that the prophet Daniel, and which, by the way, Jesus confirms, lest there be any doubt, that Daniel was a prophet. He says so right here. So there was some question about that, whether, Daniel's status as a prophet. A lot of people have tried to malign Daniel, the book of Daniel, over the years, saying it was not written when it was written, and it was written by different people, and Daniel wasn't really a prophet. They couldn't believe his prophecies were answered so specifically. It's hard for modern day man to believe that this was something supernatural. And it's hard for us to believe that this abomination of desolation and the tribulation is future prophecy. We try to spin that off as something that's already happened. And yet, as fantastic as it sounds, and as weird as it might make us seem to the world around us, this is future prophecy. Daniel would not be speaking of an abomination that makes desolate, that occurred after the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, which ended once and for all the sacrificial system. Why would he be talking about the abomination of desolation being something that brought an end to that? The continuation of that in itself was an abomination of desolation, so to speak, that they would continue to offer sacrifice for sin when their Messiah had come and Jesus had already offered the final sacrifice for sin. So this couldn't be what the prophet Daniel was talking about when it comes to the end times. This is still a future event. And then as we see here in Matthew 24, he talks about fleeing. Well, yes, there's some similarity. Yes, the nation of Israel was scattered into all nations. When you read the account in Luke, it is a little less specific, and it could lead you to believe that he was only talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. But when you read the same account in Matthew, and he adds some language and he adds some words that clarifies that no, Jesus has skipped to a different time period here as he's explaining this to the disciples. There wasn't a fleeing and going out away from Jerusalem during the 70 AD destruction. In fact, it was not at all a sure thing that Titus was going to win that battle, that he was going to easily overcome the Jews and their armies in protecting that temple. It was a little more sketchy than that. I think sometimes we have this idea that we think of the Romans and overpowering, and they just marched in, they took over, and it was easy. It was like they kind of won that battle by the skin of their teeth. It wasn't like flee, leave the temple, leave Jerusalem to destruction in 70 AD. No, it was like, no, there was a battle that went on. Jesus here is saying, when you see this abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, that's when it's flee. There's no battle going on. There's no battle that's going to take place. The battle belongs to the Lord, and when he returns and he comes back, he takes care of Jerusalem and what's going on there with the Antichrist and setting up himself as God and worship on the Temple Mount. Jesus takes care of that battle. We didn't see that happen in 70 AD. The Jews literally, and those that were aligned with them, literally could have won that battle. It wasn't an assured thing for the Romans, but it does represent Roman power and how they ultimately did conquer the known world at that time. But anyway, this isn't what this is talking about here. This is future prophecy. We see that because even when John wrote about it and was talking about the Antichrist and the setting up worship in the temple and making himself out to be God, John wrote about this in 95 AD from the island of Patmos. There's very good historical external evidence from the Bible to come up with that 95 AD date. It has been not literally challenged that much, only suggested by those that want to take the old, Reformation type belief in that the book of Revelation mostly has been fulfilled already. And so we don't have to look to it for future prophecy. I think that would be a big mistake for us to just write this off as a revelation to the Church of Christ for all ages, as just something that pertained to the disciples' day. I think that would be a big mistake with the book of Revelation. But anyway, so this is future prophecy, and Christ is revealing this to the disciples. And then he brings up this idea of false Christs and false prophets again. And yet he goes into a little bit more detail in this section. He says, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, the very elect. That's the first time we see this type of signs and wonders and miracles and deception being associated with false Christs and false prophets. They've been trying to deceive since the beginning of the church age. But yet here in this period of time that Jesus is talking about, this future period of time, it is going to be, false prophet, false Christ, powered by the Antichrist and his false prophet and his demons and dominions that has never existed in the world before. This is going to be very hard for people not to see Christ in it. This is going to be deceiving spirits to the max, that even the very elect could be fooled by this. And so this language has never been used before. And so Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Even today in the progressive church movement that is permeating into our modern day church, it doesn't seem to be a direct attack upon God. It seems to be more of like spreading God's love. It is so subtle the way that Satan attacks God's word. And he's been doing it since the time of Adam and Eve. Did God really say that? Is this really the way God is? Would he really punish you and put you to death for eating a piece of fruit? Does that sound like God? And so it's very subtle. We at the same time that you're uplifting God in his word, you're actually smashing it down. And so the attacks will be very subtle. Here it's going to be beyond max. People are going to want to believe this. And even the very elect could be fooled. But God's Spirit, through special witnesses, will be at large in these times. And so even during this time, we're going to see a great harvest of people come to know the Lord, particularly those of Jewish descent that up till this time, as far as a nation of people goes, have rejected their Messiah. That's going to change. And this 70 week of Daniel is what's going to bring about that change. It's like even during God's wrath, even when Israel went into captivity in Babylon and we're experiencing God's wrath, and even when God overthrew, the Syrians and the people that overtook the Israelites over the centuries, during those times of God's wrath, it was calling people back to himself, calling people out of pagan idol worship, calling people out of sacrificing their children to the gods, calling people out of that back to himself. And so we're going to see this again during the tribulation, where God is going to be calling people to himself. And man, it's going to be such a supernatural time and such an obvious time of signs that there's going to be no excuse for anybody that rejects that message during this time. It's kind of like God's last big push to save mankind from themselves. And so, anyway, we see that that is in particularly heavily going on in that time. And then he says, do not go look for Christ anywhere else. And now he's going to, as we get into the next verses, he's going to actually talk about his second coming. So he's gone from destruction of the temple, general signs of the second coming and the end of the age, specific prophecies for the life of his disciples and apostles going on in the first century. Now he's revealing some supernatural things about the 70-week prophecy of Daniel and that last period of time, the tribulation period. And then he's going to give them some information concerning the second coming himself. So we'll jump into that next time. Keep the faith.